The air inside the grand hall was suffocating. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the extravagant gathering. Men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns whispered among themselves, their gazes darting toward the center of the room, toward her. Melody Aqua stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. This wasn't how her life was supposed to be. She had fought so hard to carve her own path, to escape the chains of her father's world. And yet, here she was, being auctioned off like property, sold to a man she despised. Across the room, Leonardo Solarzano exuded power. He leaned against the bar with a glass of whiskey in hand, his dark eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. His jet black hair was slicked back, his sharp features carved with cold indifference. Melody hated everything about him. The way he walked, the way he spoke. So arrogant, so untouchable. But the worst part? He was her husband now. She clenched her fists as her father's voice echoed in her ears. "You will marry him, Melody. There is no other choice." No other choice. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She had dreamed of falling in love one day, of choosing the man who would share her future. But love had no place in this world. Here, marriage was just another business transaction, another way to consolidate power. And she had just been sold to the most ruthless man in the country. Leonardo finally stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He towered over her, his presence suffocating. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "Remember your class. I am higher than you, bitch." A chill ran down her spine, her fingers twitching with the urge to slap him. Instead, she forced herself to smirk. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, you're nothing but a rich bastard with an ego problem." His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to defiance. But Melody was no ordinary woman. And if Leonardo thought she would bow down to him, he was in for a hell of a surprise. The wedding was a grand spectacle, a performance for the powerful elite. The air was thick with whispers as Melody Aqua walked down the aisle, her steps slow, calculated, each one sealing her fate. She wore an exquisite white gown, its lace trailing behind her like a ghostly reminder of the innocence she had lost long ago. But she felt nothing, no excitement, no joy, only the crushing weight of betrayal. At the end of the aisle stood Leonardo Solarzano, the man she was being forced to marry. His black tuxedo fit him like a second skin, his piercing gaze locked onto her as if daring her to back out. He was stoic, powerful, unyielding, everything she despised. But the moment she reached him, the smirk on his lips was pure arrogance. "You're late," he murmured under his breath. Melody held her chin high. "I almost didn't come." His smirk widened. "Then I would have dragged you here myself." The officiant began speaking, but Melody barely heard the words. Her mind was racing, her pulse erratic. Say no, run, fight. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her father had made sure of that. If she disobeyed, the people she loved would suffer. So when the moment came, and Leonardo's deep, commanding voice rang through the hall, saying, "I do," she knew there was no turning back. With a hollow voice, she whispered the same words. "I do." And just like that, she was his. The reception was a blur of expensive champagne, forced smiles, and suffocating luxury. Melody played the part of the obedient bride, nodding at strangers who whispered about her behind their crystal glasses. But it was Leonardo who controlled the night. Every time she tried to move away, he would tighten his grip on her waist, pulling her back against him like a silent warning. As the evening dragged on, he finally leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "It's time to leave, wife." Her stomach twisted at the possessiveness in his tone, but before she could protest, he was already leading her away. The drive to their new home was silent, except for the tension that crackled like a storm between them. When they arrived at his estate, Melody felt like she was walking into a gilded cage. The mansion was vast, cold, a place without love. Leonardo watched her as she took in her new prison. "Get comfortable. You're not leaving." She turned to face him, fire in her eyes. "I will never be your obedient wife, Leonardo." He stepped closer, the air between them growing dangerously thin. "Then what will you be, Melody?" His voice was low, challenging. She could feel the heat of him, the raw power he exuded. Her heart pounded, but she refused to break. "Your worst nightmare." A slow, dark chuckle escaped his lips. "We'll see." And then, without warning, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was a claim, a battle, a war of dominance. Melody wanted to push him away, but her body betrayed her, just for a second. The taste of danger was intoxicating, but she wasn't his to own. So she shoved him back, breathless, glaring. "Don't touch me again." Leonardo only smirked. "We'll see, wife." The days that followed were a battle of wills. Leonardo was a king in his castle, commanding, untouchable, but Melody refused to bow. Every interaction between them was a game of defiance. At breakfast, she sat at the farthest end of the table, refusing to acknowledge his presence. "You're my wife, not a guest," he remarked, sipping his coffee. She didn't even look up, and yet, I feel like a prisoner. His grip on his cup tightened. "You're my responsibility now, Melody, whether you like it or not." She finally met his gaze. "I don't need saving." His smirk was cold. "We'll see." That had become his favorite phrase, and it infuriated her. But the more they fought, the more an unsettling truth began to take shape. Leonardo was dangerous, but not just in the way she thought. There were moments, fleeting and rare, where she caught something else in his eyes, something that made her chest tighten in ways she wasn't ready to face. And that terrified her more than anything. Just as Melody was beginning to understand the monster she had married, a new shadow crept into their world. A letter arrived, and signed. "She's still alive, and she remembers everything." Leonardo's expression darkened as he read the words. Melody frowned. "What is it?" But he crumpled the paper in his fist. "Nothing." She wasn't stupid. She saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, the first crack in his armor. What was he hiding? Melody's instinct screamed at her that something far bigger than their marriage was at play. Something deadly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she wasn't just fighting Leonardo. She was fighting an entire past she didn't even know she had. Melody Aqua woke up to the golden glow of the morning sun filtering through the grand windows of the mansion. But no amount of light could change the darkness of her reality. She was trapped, bound by a marriage that felt more like a prison sentence. As she stretched, her body ached, a reminder of the endless tension between her and Leonardo Solarzano. Every conversation was a battle, every glance a silent war. Just as she was about to get up, the door to her room swung open. Leonardo stepped inside, dressed in a crisp suit, his presence overwhelming the room. "You're coming with me," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. Melody narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me? Since when do you dictate my schedule?" He smirked. "Since the day you became my wife." A surge of anger flared in her chest. "I don't belong to you, Leonardo, and I never will." He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Keep telling yourself that, wife. Now, get dressed." Melody wanted to throw something at him. Instead, she lifted her chin and let out an exasperated sigh. "Where are we going?" "To see your father," he said casually, adjusting his cufflinks. Her blood ran cold. Her father. The man who had sold her like a piece of property to secure his business empire. A mixture of rage and resentment bubbled inside her, but she masked it with a cold stare. "Fine, but don't think for a second that I'm going because you told me to." Leonardo chuckled darkly. "Of course not, wife. I would never assume you'd obey me so easily." Melody grabbed a dress and stormed into the bathroom, but as she closed the door, she heard him mutter under his breath, But you will, sooner or later. The drive to her father's estate was suffocating. Leonardo sat beside her in the back seat of the luxury car, radiating dominance as he scrolled through his phone. Melody, on the other hand, kept her arms crossed, staring out the window, her mind racing. What did her father want now? Wasn't selling her to Leonardo enough? As they arrived, the gates of the Aqua estate opened, revealing a lavish mansion. Melody's stomach churned with unease. Inside, her father, Elmer Aqua, stood waiting in his study, his cold eyes scanning her like a prized possession. "You look well, Melody," he said smoothly. She clenched her jaw. "Let's skip the pleasantries, father. What do you want?" Elmer chuckled, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Straight to the point. "I raised you well." Melody felt Leonardo's presence beside her, silent, watchful. He wasn't here just for support. He was here to control the situation. "Your husband and I have business to discuss," Elmer continued, his gaze flicking toward Leonardo. "And you, my dear, will do as you're told." Melody felt her anger spike. "I'm not some chess piece for you to move around." Her father smirked. "Oh, but you are. And you always will be." Before she could retaliate, Leonardo finally spoke. "Melody is under my protection now, Elmer. Whatever plans you have for her, you'll run them through me first." The air in the room shifted, a silent battle between two powerful men. Elmer studied Leonardo before letting out a slow chuckle. Of course. You own her now, after all." Melody's stomach twisted. She hated the way they spoke about her, like she was an object, a bargaining chip. But what she hated most was the terrifying realization that, in this world, she truly was. As they left her father's estate, Melody's frustration boiled over. "You didn't have to speak for me back there," she snapped at Leonardo as they got into the car. He turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "If I hadn't, he would have walked all over you." She clenched her fists. "I can fight my own battles." Leonardo leaned closer, his eyes dark and unwavering. "Not in his world, Melody. In his world, you are nothing but a pawn. And pawns don't survive long unless they have protection." The weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. But before she could respond, Leonardo's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression suddenly shifting. A look she had never seen before, something close to concern. Melody frowned. "What is it?" He hesitated for a second before locking his phone and putting it away. "Nothing you need to worry about." Liar. She knew that look. It wasn't just business. Something was happening. Something dangerous. And whether Leonardo wanted to admit it or not, she was already caught in the middle of it. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Melody Aqua's mind spun with questions, but Leonardo was giving her nothing. That look on his face when he read that message, she had never seen it before. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. Worry. And if Leonardo Solarzano was worried, then something was seriously wrong. She crossed her arms and stared at him. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" Leonardo didn't even glance at her. "It's none of your concern." She scoffed. "You keep saying that, but last I checked, I'm your wife. Which means whatever storm is heading our way, I'm already standing in the middle of it." He let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You think this marriage makes you part of my world?" He turned to face her, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "You are still just a spectator, Melody. Stay that way if you want to live." A chill ran down her spine. He wasn't threatening her. He was warning her. The car pulled up to the mansion, and before she could press him further, Leonardo stepped out. Melody followed, her mind racing. Something was happening in the shadows, and whether he liked it or not, she wasn't going to sit on the sidelines. Melody had never felt comfortable in the Solarzano mansion. It was cold, too big, and held secrets within its walls. Even the staff looked at her with uncertainty, as if they weren't sure if she would survive this marriage. She had barely set foot inside when she heard a voice. "So, The new wife finally returns. Melody turned to see a woman standing near the grand staircase. She was tall, poised, and breathtakingly beautiful, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "And you are?" Melody asked, keeping her voice steady. The woman smirked. "Eliza Solarzano, Leonardo's ex-fiancée." The words sent a sharp jolt through Melody's chest. Ex-fiancée. Leonardo had never mentioned her. Eliza tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. "Did he not tell you about me?" TSK. Typical. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Tell me, Melody, how does it feel to be nothing more than a replacement?" Melody clenched her fists, refusing to let the words sink in. "You can play your little mind games, Eliza, but if Leonardo wanted you, he would have married you, not me." Eliza chuckled. "Oh, darling, you think he had a choice?" She leaned in and whispered, "You're just a pawn, just like I was. But the difference is, I knew how to survive." Melody's breath hitched. Before she could respond, Eliza stepped back, her smile perfectly in place. "Enjoy your stay, Mrs. Solarzano. Let's see how long you last." With that, she walked away, leaving Melody standing there, her heart pounding. The night was thick with silence, but Melody couldn't sleep. Eliza's words haunted her. "You think he had a choice?" What did that mean? Was Leonardo forced into this marriage too? She needed answers. Slipping out of bed, she made her way through the dimly lit hallways of the mansion. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of voices coming from Leonardo's study. She inched closer, pressing her ear against the door. "She can't know." Leonardo's voice was sharp, commanding. "You can't hide this from her forever," another voice argued. It was deep and familiar. Daniel, Leonardo's right-hand man. Melody held her breath. "She's not ready," Leonardo snapped. "If she finds out, she'll be in even more danger." Melody's pulse quickened. "Find out what?" Before she could hear more, the door suddenly swung open. Leonardo stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Eavesdropping wife? Melody swallowed hard but refused to back down. "If you don't want me listening, maybe you shouldn't keep secrets from me." He stepped closer, towering over her. "Go back to bed, Melody. Now." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Not until you tell me the truth." Leonardo exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "The truth, wife, is that you don't know what kind of danger you're in." Melody's heart pounded. "Then tell me." He hesitated, his expression torn. But then, as if making a decision, he finally said, "Fine, but once you know, there's no turning back." Leonardo led her inside his study and closed the door. He poured himself a drink, but didn't offer her one. That alone told her that whatever he was about to say was serious. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You weren't just married off to me, Melody. You were married into a war." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" He set his glass down. "Your father isn't just a businessman. He's been involved in illegal dealings for years. And because of that, he made enemies, dangerous ones. Enemies who don't forget and who don't forgive." Melody felt her knees weaken. Leonardo's voice hardened. "He knew that sooner or later, they would come for you. That's why he gave you to me." Her breath caught. "So you could protect me?" Leonardo let out a dark chuckle. More like, "So I could take responsibility for whatever mess he created." Melody's mind was spinning. She had been sold off not just for business, but for survival. Leonardo took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're not just my wife, Melody. You're a target." Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. Leonardo continued, his voice low and dangerous. "And if you want to stay alive, you need to start trusting me. Because right now, I'm the only one standing between you and the people who want you dead." Melody sucked in a sharp breath, realization crashing over her. This marriage wasn't just forced. It was a shield. and she had no idea how long it would hold. Melody Aqua stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. "You're not just my wife. You're a target." Leonardo's words echoed in her ears, sinking into her bones like ice. She had thought this marriage was just a business deal, an arrangement between two powerful families. But now, she realized it was something much darker. She wasn't just trapped in a loveless marriage. She was trapped in a war. Her father had married her off to save himself. Rage bubbled up inside her, but before she could react, Leonardo took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Now you know the truth. But knowing isn't enough, Melody. You need to learn how to survive." She clenched her fists. "And what if I don't want to play this game?" Leonardo's lips curled into a humorless smirk. "Then you'll die, wife." A shiver ran down her spine, but she refused to let him see her fear. No, she wouldn't be a pawn in this game. If her father had sold her off, and if Leonardo was using her as a shield, then she would find a way to turn the tables. She would become something more than a victim. She would rewrite her fate. Melody paced inside her bedroom, her mind racing. She couldn't trust her father. She couldn't trust Leonardo. And she sure as hell couldn't trust the people who wanted her dead. So who did that leave? A knock at her door snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned just as the door opened, revealing Daniel, Leonardo's right-hand man. She straightened, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" Daniel stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "You're in over your head, Mrs. Solarzano." Melody crossed her arms. "Tell me something I don't know." Daniel let out a dry chuckle, but his expression quickly turned serious. "You want to survive this? Then listen carefully." She held her breath as he continued. "Leonardo isn't your enemy, but he's also not your savior. If you want to make it through this, you need to start thinking like him." She frowned. "And what does that mean?" Daniel took a step closer. "It means you need power, Melody. Right now, you have none. You're just a pretty wife in a dangerous world." He tilted his head. "But that can change." Her pulse quickened. "How?" A slow smirk played on Daniel's lips. "Let me teach you." Melody stared at him, her heart pounding. This was it, her chance to fight back. And she was taking it. Daniel led her to a hidden training room in the mansion's underground level. Melody had no idea this place even existed. The room was lined with weapons, guns, knives, and even swords. There were punching bags, sparring mats, and a table filled with documents. Daniel turned to her. Lesson 1. Know your enemies. He grabbed a folder from the table and tossed it in front of her. Melody hesitated before opening it. Inside were photos of men she didn't recognize, each one labeled with a name, a crime, and a status. Some were dead, some were missing, and some were very much alive. "These are the people who want you dead," Daniel said, his voice unreadable. Melody's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "Why? What did I ever do to them?" Daniel exhaled. "It's not what you did. It's what your father did. He betrayed them, and now they want revenge." Her stomach twisted. Her father's sins were now hers to bear. Daniel watched her closely. "You're a Solarzano now, Melody, which means you either learn how to fight." He took a knife from the table and placed it in her hands. "Or you die." Melody looked down at the blade, her heartbeat thundering. She had never held a weapon before. But as she tightened her grip around the handle, something inside her shifted. She had spent her whole life being controlled by her father, by Leonardo, by the circumstances she never chose. No more. She met Daniel's gaze, her jaw set. "Teach me." Daniel smirked. "That's the spirit, Mrs. Solarzano." And just like that, her transformation began. Melody's fingers tightened around the knife as Daniel circled her like a predator assessing its prey. First lesson, never hesitate. Before she could react, Daniel lunged. Her instinct screamed at her to move, but she was a fraction too slow. He twisted her wrist, making her drop the knife with a sharp clatter on the cold floor. "Dead," he said flatly. "You hesitated." Melody gritted her teeth. "You didn't even give me a chance." Daniel smirked. "Your enemies won't either." He picked up the knife and pressed it back into her palm. Again. Melody inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. When Daniel moved this time, she didn't think, she reacted. She sidestepped, gripping the knife tighter. Daniel's smirk widened. "Better." They continued for hours. Attack, block, counter. Melody's muscles screamed in protest, her body covered in sweat, but she refused to stop. Pain meant she was learning. Pain meant she was growing. And she wasn't the same helpless woman from before. By the end of the session, she stood panting, knife in hand, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Power. That night, Melody barely had time to rest before she was summoned. Leonardo sat in his office, his fingers steepled together, his gaze unreadable. "You've been training." Melody lifted her chin. "Yes." Something flickered in his expression. Approval? Amusement? She couldn't tell. "You should have started sooner," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. She frowned. "What do you mean?" Leonardo's eyes darkened. "Your father isn't the only one with secrets, Melody." He slid a folder across the desk. She hesitated before opening it, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside were documents proving her real lineage. Her mother wasn't the woman she had believed. Her true mother was Elmer's sister, the very family her father had betrayed. Melody's stomach lurched. This can't be real." Leonardo watched her carefully. "It is. That's why they want you dead, Melody. You are a living reminder of your father's greatest sin." She clenched her fists. "Then I'll make them regret ever thinking I'd be easy to kill." Leonardo's lips curled into a smirk. "Good answer, wife." The next morning, Melody woke up to an envelope slipped under her door. She ripped it open, her pulse spiking as she read the contents. An invitation to a gala hosted by one of her enemies. She stormed into Leonardo's office, slamming the letter on his desk. "Did you know about this?" Leonardo barely looked up. "Of course." She glared. "And you weren't going to tell me?" He finally met her gaze, his expression cool. "I was waiting to see what you'd do." Melody's heart pounded. This was a trap. She knew it, but at the same time, it was an opportunity. She inhaled deeply. "I'm going." Leonardo's brows lifted. "Bold move. Are you sure?" She nodded, her grip tightening on the letter. "I need to face them sooner or later, and I'd rather it be on my terms." Leonardo smirked. "Then let's get you ready, Mrs. Solarzano. It's time for your debut into the world of monsters." The grand ballroom of the Solaris Hotel gleamed under golden chandeliers. Power pulsed through the air like a silent storm, each guest draped in wealth and secrets. Melody Aqua walked in, her emerald silk gown flowing like liquid, her head held high. She was no longer the pawn. Tonight, she was the predator. Leonardo walked beside her, his presence commanding. He leaned in, his lips barely brushing her ear. "Eyes are on you, wife. Smile." She did. But inside, her heart pounded. Across the room, she saw Elmer, standing with a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze locked onto hers, sharp and calculating. The man who had tried to erase her existence. A waiter passed by, and Melody smoothly took a glass of champagne, using it to steady herself. She was ready for this. Elmer approached, his smirk dripping with mockery. "Ah, Melody Aqua. Or should I say, Mrs. Solarzano?" Melody refused to flinch. "Elmer." His dark eyes flickered with amusement. "You have your mother's fire. Pity it won't save you." Leonardo placed a possessive hand on Melody's waist. "She doesn't need saving." Elmer chuckled. "We'll see." The music shifted into a waltz. To her shock, Elmer extended his hand. "Dance with me." Melody hesitated. Was this a test? A warning? She glanced at Leonardo, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. So she placed her hand in Elmer's. They moved across the dance floor, a battle disguised as grace. Elmer leaned in. "Do you really think Leonardo will protect you forever?" Melody smiled sweetly. "I don't need him to." Elmer's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Good. Let him know she was not weak. Then, he whispered something that sent ice down her spine. "Enjoy tonight, Melody. It might be your last." The gala continued, but Melody couldn't shake Elmer's words. Something was coming. Then, chaos erupted. A blood-curdling scream tore through the ballroom. Guests turned in horror as a body crashed through the glass ceiling. A man, his throat slit, falling in front of Melody's feet. A note was pinned to his chest. "You're next." Gasps filled the air. Security swarmed. Leonardo pulled Melody behind him, his face dark with fury. "Get her out of here. Now." Daniel grabbed her arm, dragging her through a back exit. But Melody barely felt his grip. She wasn't scared. She was angry. Elmer thought this would break her? He had no idea what kind of woman she had become. The moment Melody stepped into the underground safe house, the reality of the threat settled in. She traced the words on the blood-stained note in her hands. "You're next." Her grip tightened. Daniel paced the room, arms crossed. That message wasn't just for you. It was a declaration of war. Leonardo stood by the window, his face like carved stone. Elmer is done playing games. Melody exhaled slowly. "Then neither am I." Leonardo turned, his gaze locking onto hers. "Melody." "I want in," she interrupted. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "In?" She lifted her chin. "I won't sit in the shadows while my enemies plot my death. Teach me how to kill." Leonardo studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, finally, approval. "Fine," he said, "but there's no turning back." Melody smirked. "I don't plan to." The first time Melody held a gun, her hands shook. Daniel scoffed. "You wanted this. Don't back out now." Melody scowled, steadying her grip. "I'm not." She aimed at the target, a silhouette of a man. Leonardo's voice was calm but firm. "The moment you hesitate, you're dead. Again." She inhaled, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. Bang. The bullet hit its mark, dead center. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Not bad, princess." Melody turned, confidence burning in her chest. Again. She trained for hours. Guns, knives, hand-to-hand combat. She was bruised, exhausted, but she never gave up. Because when the time came, she would be the one pulling the trigger. 3 days later, Melody sat across from an unexpected guest. Elmer's right-hand man. The dimly lit club buzzed with energy, but their table was drenched in tension. Melody leaned forward. "I assume you didn't risk your life to chat." The man smirked. "You catch on quick." Leonardo watched in silence, letting her lead. Melody swirled her drink. "What do you want?" The man's smile faded. "Elmer is planning something big. A massacre." She stilled. "When?" "In 48 hours. And you're the centerpiece." Melody's blood ran cold, but only for a second. Then, she smirked. "Let him come. This time, I'll be ready." The warehouse smelled of rust and death. Melody Aqua stood at the center, surrounded by shadows, her heartbeat steady. She wasn't the hunted anymore. Tonight, she was the predator. Footsteps echoed. Then, Elmer emerged from the darkness, flanked by armed men. His smirk was pure arrogance. "You should have stayed dead, Melody." She tilted her head. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." Elmer chuckled. "You think you've won?" Melody's fingers flexed. I don't think, Elmer. I know. A single click. Then, gunfire erupted from the shadows. Leonardo and Daniel's men stormed in, bullets flying. Chaos exploded in an instant. Elmer snarled, pulling out his own gun. Melody moved first. She ducked, rolled, and fired. Bang! Elmer stumbled back, clutching his bleeding arm. But she wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. Melody stalked toward him, her voice deadly calm. You destroyed my life. You took everything from me. Elmer spat blood, glaring. So kill me already. She pressed the gun to his forehead. Then, she smiled. No, you don't deserve an easy death. With a swift movement, she struck him across the face with the gun, knocking him unconscious. The fight was over. Weeks later, Melody stood in the penthouse, staring at the city skyline. Elmer was gone, rotting in a place worse than death. And Melody? She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was ruling. Leonardo stepped behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. Regrets? Melody smiled, power thrumming through her veins. Not a single one. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.